Howdy! Welcome to Aspire Mountain Academy. I'm Professor Curtis, your instructor for this course in Introductory Statistics. In less than 10 minutes, this video shows how to make and use scatter plots. Let's get started. In the previous mini lectures, we've talked about histograms, and while they are important, there are many other graphs we can make to represent our data. Some of them prove more useful than histograms in certain situations. So we really need to find the visual representation that most effectively reveals the characteristics of our data set we're most interested in seeing. Now, some graphs are less effective because they contain errors. Other graphs are less effective just because of the way they're presenting the visual data. And then there are those graphs that are less effective because, while they're technically correct, the way they're constructed tends to mislead an audience. So it's really important to develop the critical thinking skills to recognize a poorly constructed graph and identify exactly how it is misleading an audience. So starting with this mini lecture, we're going to look at the types of graphs that effectively communicate or visually represent a data set. And then we'll go into graphs that deceive by the way they're constructed. And when you're talking about visual representations for data, you've got to start out with scatter plots. In the real world, one of the first things I always did with a new data set was make a scatter plot because they tell you so much about your data and they can tell you what, if any, next steps are needed in your analysis. Now, you need paired data to make a scatter plot because all you do to make a scatter plot is you just use your paired data like X and Y variables on a graph and plot your data points on a standard Cartesian coordinate plane. Pretty simple, but also pretty powerful because scatter plots can reveal potential relationships between two variables. So looking at the scatter plot that we have here on the screen, you've got numbers of users versus memory. We're trying to see the memory that's being used by the number of users. You've got so many users using so much memory on your computer system. So you're looking for a trend that you can use to predict how much memory you're going to need to provide your users and when. Now, the scatter plot here clearly shows us there may be a relationship here. You can then perform further analysis to make a prediction on when you'll need so much more memory. Okay. Now, here's another example of a scatter plot. This one's showing no real relationship between your variables, which are quality and price. Sometimes you get good quality for a little price. Okay, so good quality here for relatively little price. Okay, so you've got that, but then sometimes you have to pay for the quality you want. Okay, so to get the good quality, sometimes you have to pay at a higher price. So there's no real pattern here to look at. The data points aren't following any trend, they go everywhere. And when I see this type of scatter plot, I like to call this the shotgun effect, because it looks like someone took out their shotgun and blew holes in a wall. And this shotgun effect is a red flag that you don't really need to look any further into this combination of variables because there's just no real relationship here. Okay. Now, making scatter plots in Statcrunch is pretty simple. Let's use our POTUS file in our Statcrunch group to illustrate how this is done. For those who may not know, POTUS is an acronym that stands for President of the United States. Our data file called POTUS contains all sorts of data on U.S. presidents who were elected to office. Okay, that's key. Elected to office. So you won't find, for example, Gerald Ford in the list. Okay, because Mr. Ford here, he was never elected to office. He was the vice president when President Richard Nixon resigned as a result of the Watergate scandal. Okay, now there's a story to learn more about if you don't know what went on there. Okay, secret break-in into a campaign office just before an election was discovered, the would-be spies arrested, there's a president who tries to cover it up, and eventually ends up with a constitutional tug-of-war with Congress over tapes of recorded phone conversations and a controversy that led President Nixon to resign. It's troubling that it happened, but it's also great drama. So if you don't know the story, definitely look into it. What we're going to do here okay, is make a scatter plot for the heights of elected U.S. presidents versus that of their electoral opponents to see if there's any sort of relationship here between the one who wins the election and the one who loses. Does being taller or shorter help you win the election? So once you have your data in Statcrunch here, go up to Graph and then Scatter Plot. And then in the Options window, select your X and Y variables. Make sure you match your variables with the right axis. If you want the height of presidents to be on the X-axis, then make sure you put that there. Now, for those of you working MyMathLab assignments, generally the X variable will be whichever one is mentioned first, because the X is listed first when you list an ordered pair. And most of the default settings here are pretty great for our purposes, so just go ahead, hit Compute. When you do, you get your pretty little scatter plot here, and wow, look at what we've got, another shotgun effect. Now, what is this scatter plot telling us about a relationship between the heights of winners and losers in U.S. presidential elections? Well, this shotgun effect tells us that there's no real relationship between the variables we're looking at. Therefore, we don't need to go any further with any sort of more in-depth statistical analysis. Okay, presidents are not chosen for their height. And that brings us to the end of this mini lecture. I hope you found it helpful. You can find more mini lectures for this and other courses at AspireMountainAcademy.com. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next video.